Day 6. 1200 hours to 1600 hours. The other world lay in front of them. The harsh desert was exposed and yellow, but there was no heat or sign of any change in the climate. Diamonds and rare jewels were strewn across the floor as if they had been there for millennia. The Juggernaut continued on its journey. The travellers had been driving for 6 hours, and as the meter in the cab had been showing a steady 60 miles an hour, they must have covered over 350 miles. But there was no sign of any sentient life or activity. The smoke poured up towards the horizon, and they were no closer to arriving at their destination, wherever and whatever that might be. They drove past an elephant wandering around lost, looking confused and desperate for food. At one point, they also passed a beached whale, squirming in the desert. The Doctor did not appear surprised, and the journey continued, wordless. Blake found the continuous stark colours and the bare uninhabited world disturbing in a way he could not identify. There was a feel to the world unlike anything he had come across back in England. The Doctor had talked about a drug being in the atmosphere which created a feeling of unnatural well-being, but there was something else here. "You know something more than you are telling me," Blake said to his companion. "This is all an illusion. This machine should have run out of petrol many hours ago," said the Doctor, sounding as if he did not want to be interrupted. He wanted to be left to himself. Blake decided that his thoughts were not welcomed by the time traveller. He sat back in the motor vehicle as the Doctor noticeably increased the speed of the journey. The Juggernaut bucked, and the poet held onto the side to prevent himself being thrown around. He momentarily closed his eyes. It was difficult to tell the passage of time, but when Blake opened his eyes they appeared to be within reach of the rising smoke. He must have been asleep for hours. He looked behind and saw the desert stretched out. "How long have I been asleep?" Blake asked. "What is time?" the Doctor replied enigmatically. The Juggernaut was approaching the origin of the smoke. Thousands of slaves, naked and in pain, were breaking rocks and moving the rubble in long columns towards the burning embers of a huge pyre. Slave masters strode through the crowds of men and women, whipping them if they slowed down or showed any interest in the travellers. "Kujach!" one of the slaves begged, breaking free and looking towards the travellers. Although his chains still held him tight, the slavers grabbed him and burnt him with searing irons. He screamed, and then was silent. "Ach, Nakai," the Doctor muttered to himself. Closer to the smoking fire, Blake could see that the colours of the flames varied with the different amounts of crushed rocks thrown onto the pyre. "Chemicals?" Blake asked. The Doctor nodded. The slaves continued to pound away. They seemed demoralised and miserable, operating an endless mechanical process. As the travellers continued their journey, they passed a number of open mines. At each one, slaves carried out rocks and deposited them in piles. The rocks were also found lying on the ground. "Doctor!" Blake interrupted his travelling companion's silent thoughts. The Doctor did not acknowledge him. "I have made a study of the fall, how men challenged the gods in their search for knowledge, and were banished from Eden. I believe the story in the Bible, and other holy books, is a myth, but based on a simple truth." The Doctor did not reply immediately. There seemed to be a tear in his eye. "As I've travelled the universe, I've come across the myths of many planets. They all share certain elements in common. One of those elements is the story of an all-powerful race who tried to conquer and destroy creation, a race banished from this universe. The myths of Gallifrey talk about nameless horrors infesting our universe, which were only defeated through the might of the Time Lords. I didn't think it was real, but then on my travels I met a vampire which had escaped a great war with the Time Lords of Gallifrey. The High Council had kept it a secret. I didn't know why. I still don't know why." Blake listened as the Doctor tried to explain the confusion in his head. "What is happening here?" Blake asked. "I think that it is once again preparing an attack on our universe. Not just the crazed fanatics who follow it, but it and its legions. the doctor replied. Vampires. Hideous, half-glimpsed nightmare creatures. Does it have a name? Blake asked. The doctor pondered. Yiskaroth, Blake repeated. Yiskaroth, a word used by frightened children to describe nameless, formless horrors which await you in the fog or around the next corner. The travellers were heading out into the empty desert. The doctor stopped the juggernaut. He said that he wanted to inspect the rocks on the ground. He left the vehicle and moved over to the rocks. He kicked one, and it disintegrated into a white powder. He rubbed some of the powder in his hands, sniffed it, and threw it back onto the ground. Blake went to pick up a handful of the substance, but the doctor kicked it out of his grasp. You must leave it alone. Don't touch it. What is it? Blake asked. It's an addictive hallucinogenic drug. Throughout the universe it's known as Dream Bee. Its followers used the drug in their hideous rituals in Victorian London. I didn't think it was known on Earth. Not yet. I've visited future worlds which have been devastated by the drug, where the young people have been completely wiped out by this substance. Suddenly, as they talked, arrows started to rain down on them, landing uncomfortably close to the two travellers. The doctor ran for cover, grabbing the poet's sleeve and pulling him to the side. The attack was aimed at the motor vehicle. As Blake lay on the floor, he watched the arrows soaring into the air about 100 yards away and then falling towards their target. Whispers of smoke were visible on the arrows. 20 flaming arrows hit the juggernaut. The cab caught fire. Down! The doctor shouted, pushing the poet's head into the sand. As Blake wriggled, he heard the sound of an explosion and felt a rush of cold air. Blake looked up. The juggernaut was in flames. They were not going to escape from hell in the 20th century craft. A dozen figures stood up, cheering. Their faces were painted to look like skulls. They ran over to the two prostrate travellers and danced insanely around them. They were armed with bows and arrows, were all male, and had shaved heads. They jumped up and down, signalling wildly. Occasionally they would beat on their chests, sit on the ground, and then stand up. Their eyes darted excitedly around. The doctor was nodding, as if in agreement. "What are they saying?" Blake asked his companion. "I've no idea. It sounds like gibberish to me," the doctor said. The figures moved around them, waving their arms in a coordinated movement towards each other. And then Blake heard music. It sounded like a mouth organ. The figures were dancing. He thought that this was extraordinary. He turned to the doctor. The doctor was holding a harmonica, tapping his feet, and playing a piece of music he called Jimmy Crack Corn. The travellers' music captured a feel of adventure yet sorrow. "It's called the blues," the doctor shouted, taking a pause for breath. Blake looked on astonished. He thought they should be trying to escape, not entertaining the enemy. The musical interlude went on for 10 minutes and finished with the mad figures collapsing on the ground. The doctor smiled cheerfully, waved, and walked off. "Come on," the doctor said under his breath, "and smile." Blake followed. B, one of the figures said, standing up. "No, we've finished," said the doctor. B. Another figure stood, looking far from friendly. He walked over to the doctor, waving a knife at the traveller's throat. "Well, if you insist," the doctor said. B. The figure put the knife at the doctor's throat. The skull figures grabbed hold of the travellers. "A most unappreciative audience," the doctor said. They walked for about an hour before arriving at their destination. However, the doctor was happy as they were brought directly to the industrial centre of the world. Blake didn't know how much longer he would survive. The journey was unbearable, marching along with the chattering fools, and the doctor more interested in the past of his people. They arrived at a huge dome. The structure appeared to have been built into the air, with scaffolding and support systems running up towards the sky. Thousands of slaves marched in step. The slave masters ran around, punishing anyone who slowed down or became disobedient. Drums beat to mark the rhythm of the work. However, within 15 minutes of their arrival, the speed increased twice. A number of silos were positioned about a mile from the structure. They appeared to contain tons of Dream B, but Puchchin delivered further supplies. Blake noticed the demons flying overhead. "What is the building?" Blake asked. "A bridgehead," the doctor replied. The Kun wandered round trying to buy bodies. They continued their bloodthirsty chatter as they identified the weak and the injured and went over to negotiate a purchase price. "Death will be very welcome," Blake said. He was tired and, seeing all the pain, felt a quick death would be more inviting a proposition than a hot bath. The doctor turned to him. "You don't understand. There's no death here. These slaves have been here thousands of years. They've been digging for the chemicals, been tortured and crucified again and again. There is no welcome release here. There's just pain and more pain." "Why don't they revolt?" Blake asked. "Where is there to go? They're trapped here." A Kun walked over to take a closer look at the two travellers. It hissed and spat in their faces. It wiped the spittle, trying to clean off the dirt. It shook its head and walked away. After much discussion, the Kun traded a bag of raw meat in exchange for the travellers. The Kun sniffed around them. One particularly gross creature walked alongside them with its stomach rumbling. Blake said to his companion that he should take a last look at the hole in time and their escape. The doctor pointed elsewhere. One of the Kun seemed to be in an argument with a jackal creature, which the doctor said was a galk. 4 galks stood listening to the conversation. They were twice the size of dogs and stood erect on their hind feet. The Kun appeared to be reticent about arguing with them. Eventually, a Kun bowed and indicated for his brethren to follow him. The others snarled at the Gulks and walked away. Blake began to follow them, but the main Gulk stood in his way. As the Gulks led them into the desert, the travellers could see the Kun arguing with the Skull People, trying to reclaim their raw meat. The Gulks moved with a slow, pronounced movement. "Hello, I'm the doctor, and this is William Blake, the poet, you know," the doctor said, trying his simpleton act. It didn't work. The Gulks ignored him. "Any chance of some food?" the doctor asked. After about 15 minutes, they arrived at their destination. A throne stood in the middle of the desert. The throne was made of gold and sparkled with a multitude of jewels. The Gulks untied the travellers, bowed to the throne, and retreated. The poet and the time traveller stood alone in the desert. "I think we're about to meet our hosts," the doctor said. Blake stared at the empty throne. There seemed to be something happening. His vision was misting over. And then, in front of them, appeared a small lamb. He smiled. The lamb bounded onto the seat of the throne and turned to face them. "I hope you are all right, gentlemen," it said, in a high, squeaky voice. "Thank you," said the poet. The doctor remained silent. "I want to help you escape from this terrible place," said the lamb. Blake felt comfortable because the lamb offered to return them home. "I don't believe you," the doctor shouted. Blake looked at him. What was he talking about? Why was he being so rude? "Doctor, he is trying to help," Blake explained. "No. You might be able to influence my friend, but I won't believe you, and I will stand up to you. There's nothing you can do," the doctor continued. A long tongue came out of the lamb's mouth as it licked its lips. It laughed to itself. "Doctor, you failed to go along with my charade. That upsets me. Don't you realize that I can inflict billions of years of exquisite suffering and pain on you?" the lamb said. The doctor started to scream. He held his head as if his brain was exploding. "Don't you realize, Time Lord? We are returning to your paltry universe, and nothing can stop us now. Abandon all hope." The Time Lord fell onto the floor, and the pain ceased. The lamb bounded around laughing, and then disappeared. The throne was empty. And then Blake felt the ground tremble. It was like an earthquake. The desert was shaking around them. The sand started to rise up like a cloud of dust. "What is it?" Blake started to ask, and then he saw. From around the throne something was unravelling its body. It was hundreds of feet long, initially resembling a huge snake uncoiling itself. The skin was covered with a wet, dripping substance. He could also see bits of horns or wings down the side. Could this thing fly? Blake couldn't believe that this was one creature. It seemed many of these things were squirming around together. And then there was the smell of rotting flesh. He felt he was going to... And then he vomited. The stench was overpowering. "Doctor, what's your plan?" Blake asked. "After much consideration and examining all the options, I suggest we run. Now!" the doctor shouted. Blake agreed with his companion and beat a hasty retreat back to the hole in time. It never occurred to him that he was too tired or ill. He had to run for his life. "Don't look back, just run!" shouted the doctor. The travellers' flight took them across the desert. "We must destroy the hole and prevent them returning to our universe," the doctor said. "Isn't that what the Time Lords tried to do and failed?" Blake replied. "And anyway, there are many of these holes from which the monsters could escape into our universe." "We can't give up," the doctor said. Blake needed to rest. He turned around and slowed down, seeing no sign of the monsters. The doctor didn't seem tired and continued to run. "Don't stop!" he shouted, running on ahead. Blake sighed and ran to catch up with his travelling companion. He had lost his watch back in Victorian London, and so had no clear idea of time. It may have taken minutes or hours to get back to the hole in time. There were thousands more slaves now, working to finish the bridgehead. They marched in columns, 10 slaves wide, thousands moving as one together. As one slave put his left foot forward, so did several hundred others. Hunters were gathering over the dome. Hundreds of the creatures hovered in the air, swooping down in mock delight. The air was full of their squawking. Blake looked around. "How are we going to get out of here?" "We're not," said the doctor. "We have to stop them." "There are 2 of us and hundreds of thousands of them," Blake said. "I admit the odds aren't in our favour," the doctor smiled. "But we must do something." He moved up to a slave. The slave didn't even glance at him. The slave looked 50, with pale, battered skin, hopeless eyes, and an emaciated, run-down body. Thousands of similar slaves worked all around them. The doctor tried to communicate with the slave in English, but received no response. "Aslik mujun to omo," the doctor said. Hearing the ancient Gallifreyan language, the slave slowed down in his work. He looked at the doctor and spat in his face. He moved off, continuing his heavy work. The doctor looked sad and tired. Blake shivered. As the doctor continued his efforts to communicate with the slaves, Blake noticed the Galks talking to the Kun. A Galk hit a Kun across the face and then tore into it with savage teeth. The Galks left the injured Kun and began to walk amongst the slaves, searching for the travellers. The demons noticed the injured body and began to fly over the struggling figure. "The Harpies of Destruction," Blake said. "Time is running out," said the doctor. "What?" "I didn't want to come back here. Somehow I knew what existed here went back to the ancient history of my people, to a time when all seemed ideal." The doctor smiled again. "I wanted to run away, to hide, but I had to return to this lonely, meaningless place." The doctor joined a slow-moving column of slaves, carrying concrete slabs over to the dome. He moved down the column. He smiled, said, "Hello," and then unexpectedly stuck out his foot and tripped up one of the slaves. As the slave stumbled, so did another, and then another. The whole column proceeded to fall onto the ground. The doctor darted over to a pile of broken rocks. He pulled out his sonic screwdriver. The screwdriver emitted a loud, incessant scream. Blake shook with the pain. Smoke started to pour out of the mounds, and the crackling of small fireworks sounded from inside the stocks of Dream B. The doctor filled his pockets with the rocks. The Galks saw the time traveller, lowered themselves onto all fours, and bounded across the desert. The doctor ignored them, climbing up the scaffolding to the roof of the dome. Blake followed the doctor. "What are we doing, Doctor?" Blake asked. "Sabotage. We'll set fire to the rocks up here and create a huge explosion. It'll stop the Isgaroth for a few hours, and kill us in the meantime." "I'm sorry. I can't think of anything else," the doctor replied. Blake had a good view of the world from the roof of the dome. From where they stood, everything seemed to be smaller. He could see people and creatures on the ground below, and in the distance shapes moved under the desert sands. The Isgaroth was sliding underneath the surface of the earth towards them. The doctor had filled his pockets with Dream B. He pulled out the rocks and placed them in small piles. "What's the purpose of the dome?" Blake asked. "To transport it and its forces into our universe," the doctor said. "We've moved through the hole in time, so have the hunters. Can't the monsters too?" Blake asked. "Obviously not," the doctor replied, trying to prevent the rocks slipping down the roof of the dome. His footing was precarious. "Doctor, what are you going to do? The powder isn't going to have any effect on the dome." The doctor replied in a drifting Scottish accent. "I know, but we have to do something. We have to—" As he spoke, he lost his balance and he fell. He tumbled through the air and stopped. He started floating to the hole. Blake was astonished and found himself moving towards the doctor. Blake felt that he was standing on something. He stretched out his arms, but had no room to maneuver. He was in a cage, an invisible cage. Blake struggled, but to no avail. The cage moved away from the dome and towards the hole. "No, I need to stay," the doctor shouted desperately. They were powerless to resist. The invisible cage removed them from the other world.